For decades, the Nordic nations of Finland and Sweden have maintained a state of political neutrality, maintaining cordial relations with both Russia and the West. However, this changed earlier this year with the Russian-led invasion of Ukraine, which sparked fears that the northern European nations might be the next target for Russian aggression. In response to this, both Helsinki and Stockholm have given indications of joining NATO, an alliance of European and North American powers designed to provide collective defense against hostility. This new sentiment is in direct response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February. According to recent polling data, a majority of Swedes are in favor of joining the alliance, an increase over pre-invasion numbers. In Finland, the shift in sentiment is even more pronounced, with 68% of the Finnish population in favor of joining NATO, a figure which has more than doubled in the wake of Russian aggression. This might be due to Finland's precarious geographical location, sharing over 800 miles of border with Russia, an obvious vulnerability should hostilities break out. Of course, the Russian government is less than pleased with the news. One of the main justifications for the invasion of Ukraine is the expansion of NATO membership since the end of the Cold War, encroaching on Russia's sphere of influence. Sentiment in the Kremlin is that NATO is acting in a manner to isolate Russia from the rest of Europe, in order to benefit the West, specifically the United States. It was stated that, should the two nations join the alliance, Russia is going to be forced to restore military balance, quote-unquote. To this end, additional military forces will be sent to the border of the Nordic nations and the Baltic coast, which might include nuclear weapons. Despite these threats, Finland and Sweden are expected to submit applications to join NATO in mid-May of this year, with the formal membership granted at the Madrid summit in June. Officially, both countries have remained politically neutral, but the shift towards joining NATO is decades in the making. Starting as far back as 1994, both nations joined NATO's Partnership for Peace program, which is a move that allows individual nations to cooperate with the alliance without membership or any specific commitment. In 1995, Finland and Sweden both joined the EU, another Western power bloc that is at odds with Russia. In the years since then, both nations have conducted regular military exercises with NATO members, especially Norway, which would make any future integration into the alliance easier. Furthermore, Finland has already committed military forces to NATO, participating in the NATO Rapid Response Force, an international collection of military units that could respond quickly in the event of an emergency. So, with membership all but inevitable, the question now is, what can these nations bring to the table? On paper, it doesn't seem like much. Both nations are small with comparatively tiny populations and minuscule military forces, especially compared to their potential foes like Russia or allies like the United States. Sweden has a population of around 10.5 million people, with a military of about 24,000 personnel. Finland has a total population of 5.5 million people, with a military of less than 22,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen. For comparison, the United States has a population of 330 million, with a military consisting of almost 1.5 million. Still, despite these numbers, there is much that can be offered by these nations. The first is obviously location. Finland shares an 800-mile border with Russia. This does make them vulnerable, but it would also act as a buffer zone, adding another layer of defense and buying time for the rest of NATO to organize a response. Furthermore, both nations will provide convenient staging grounds for any counteroffensive, making Russia's northern flank way more vulnerable. Both nations' naval assets as well as port facilities would also help in control over the Baltic, a vital waterway should any conflict break out. Already, Sweden has experience in this field, participating in hunting Russian submarines that have violated its territorial waters. In spite of the size of the militaries, both Finland and Sweden are very well armed and very well trained, utilizing the latest of technology, including the Swedish-made Saab JAS-39 Gripen, both used by Sweden and Finland, as well as the American-made FA-18 Hornet, used by Finland. Finland is also updating its fighter wing to include the state-of-the-art F-35 Lightning II, although these aren't quite in service yet. There are also significant intelligence assets available in both nations. Finland in particular has taken a keen interest in Russia's plans and has invested heavily in deciphering the objectives of its next-door neighbor. When combined with the resources of other NATO intelligence services, tracking the Kremlin's next moves should become much easier. Even before the current hostile geopolitical climate, steps have been taken to ensure national safety and sovereignty. Given its vulnerable position, Finland has taken its national defense very seriously. In addition to its professional military force, the nation can also call upon its large reserves of conscripts. Around 3/4 of Finland's male population undergo some military training and act as reservists until needed. The only ones who do not are those given medical deferments or a very tiny percentage of conscientious objectors. Should the need arise, these men could all be called up, bolstering the strength of the regular forces. There are also the Border Guard, which doesn't fall under official military strength, being part of the Interior Ministry, which can also be deployed to resist any potential aggression. Still, in spite of these advantages, should Russia launch a full-scale invasion through the Nordic countries, there seems to be little that such tiny forces could do, in spite of their apparent quality, making their addition to NATO seem more of a liability than an asset. The overwhelming might of Russian military can simply swat aside any resistance, and both countries would then be conquered before allies could arrive to rescue them. However, numbers aren't everything in a conflict. In the winter of 1939 to 1940, the Soviet Union launched an invasion of Finland. Over 600,000 soldiers, supported by tanks, artillery, and aircraft, marched across the border, expecting an easy victory over the tiny Finnish defensive forces. They had very few tanks, they had fewer planes. They weren't prepared for a conflict of this scale. But instead of an easy victory, however, they were subjected to a 105-day meat grinder, which saw the death of around 200,000 men. Finland, in contrast, lost around 25,000 men. And there it is revealed, their greatest asset: attrition. In a direct confrontation, there is little that Sweden, Finland, or any other Baltic nation could do. They're so small, they can't resist the Russian aggression. However, in such a situation, they would not fight in a direct confrontation. Rather, during the Winter War, while much of the fighting was a conventional battle along the Mannerheim line, a great deal of the fighting was what the Finns called a war of detachment. Lightly armed ski troops would ambush Soviet supply columns before melting back into the forest. Snipers, such as the legendary White Death Simo Häyhä, would pick off Red Army soldiers as they struggled through the deep snow. In an attempt to avoid the deep forests, which were home to these partisans, many Soviet commanders attempted to use the frozen lakes and rivers as highways. To remedy this, Finnish engineers rigged the ice with explosive charges, sending countless Soviets to a watery grave. This forced the Red Army to use well-traveled paths such as logging trails and main roadways, easy targets for the ski and snowshoe-equipped Finns, who could approach from any direction, or for carefully placed machine gun positions to gun down scores of the enemy. Soviet soldiers were constantly on alert, never able to rest. Even when in seemingly secure areas, there was no telling when the next strike could occur. The Finns also made extensive use of mines and booby traps, even in isolated hamlets, turning rapid-moving assaults into painstaking slogs as roads, bridges, homes, barns, and other structures had to be searched and cleared. Morale collapsed, and though the Soviets were eventually successful, the loss of life dented the reputation of the Red Army. These lessons, called moti tactics, the Finnish word for a measure of firewood, have been adopted into Nordic defensive strategies. Rather than go toe-to-toe with Russian forces, they would instead fall back, drawing the enemy into deep, inhospitable terrain. Air forces have practiced using highways as landing strips, making any paved surface long enough as a potential runway, rather than relying on specific air bases that could easily be attacked. Other air defenses include the mobile SAM, surface-to-air missile sites, which can be moved quickly from one location to another, engage an enemy aircraft, and then retreat to another location before the enemy can respond. Naval warfare includes underwater mines and fast attack craft that could launch hit-and-run attacks against larger, more cumbersome ships in a congested waterway along the coast, rather than slug it out in open water. On land, similar tactics as those used in the Winter War would be used, but with modern equipment such as anti-tank guided missiles, lightweight artillery, night vision, and other gear that would have been unheard of in 1940. This is the most valuable asset that the addition of Finland and Sweden can provide to NATO. Should the need arise, it'll take a tremendous amount of time to mobilize resources, including setting up the extensive logistics systems needed to maintain a large fighting force. While the more powerful nations, such as the United States and the United Kingdom, prepare to face a Russian invasion with brute force, the Russian military would be engaged in a grinding war of attrition against small, mobile forces. Unable to decisively defeat such tiny forces, Russian troops would be engaged in a slow search and destroy mission against these foes, and they would simply slip away to strike again at another location. While distracted, the hammer blow of a NATO counteroffensive could be launched, driving the enemy back before it could penetrate too deeply into Western Europe. Whether this strategy will ever be needed remains to be seen, but the entry of Sweden and Finland into NATO will no doubt shift the power dynamics in the ever-increasingly hostile geopolitical climate. We thank you for watching. Please support this channel by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. And please, don't forget to share with your friends as well. See you all next time.